Go.
Peanuts.
Do it again.
My peanuts.
Do it like it hurts.
It hurts.
This morning on a story that broke hearts, police say a mother stood by and did nothing while her boyfriend beat her little boy for days.
No, it was like a monster. Like his eyes were black. There was nothing to him. Like he was just an empty person walking around.
Carrying the promise of an ordinary, peaceful day. But nothing about what followed would be ordinary. The warmth of that moment, the innocence in Dominick's laughter, would soon be overshadowed by something no child should ever endure. A boy so full of life, whose biggest worry had been finding his favorite toy, would face an unthinkable fate. A tragedy so profound that it would shake an entire community, leaving behind questions too painful to answer. How could something so horrific happen in a place where neighbors exchanged greetings on their way to work, where doors were left unlocked without a second thought? How does a town built on quiet streets and friendly faces become the setting for a crime so cruel? Dominick's story is not just one of loss. It is one of innocence betrayed, a reminder of the dangers that can lurk where least expected. This is the truth of what happened to Dominick Calhoun, and the lessons left behind in the wake of his tragic end. Nestled in the heart of Michigan, the small town of Linden carried the essence of quiet, suburban life. With a population of just over 3,000, it was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, where families gathered for summer barbecues, and where the laughter of children echoed through tree-lined streets. It wasn't unusual to see kids riding their bikes to the corner store or playing in their front yards without worry. The town itself, surrounded by lakes and dense woodlands, had an unspoken sense of security, one built on years of shared traditions and neighborly trust. Life in Linden moved at an easy pace. The local diner always had a fresh pot of coffee brewing, and on weekends the town square came alive with farmers markets and community events. Parents felt safe letting their children run free in the parks, knowing someone was always watching out for them. It was a place where bad things weren't supposed to happen. But in April 2010, that belief was shattered. A tragedy unfolded that was so cruel, so deeply unsettling, that it left an irreparable scar on the town. The kind of horror no one could have imagined creeping into their peaceful world had, in fact, been hiding in plain sight. At just 4 years old, Dominick Richard Calhoun embodied everything that made childhood so pure. His world was one of wide-eyed wonder, filled with simple joys. Picking dandelions in the front yard, racing his toy cars across the kitchen floor, and laughing until his stomach hurt. With his bright blonde hair and an infectious smile, he had a way of making people around him feel lighter, as if his joy was something they could share. Dominick was the kind of child who made friends effortlessly. Whether at the playground or on the steps of his apartment complex, he found excitement in the smallest things. To those who knew him, he was a bright spot in an otherwise ordinary world, a child full of life, of curiosity, of boundless energy. But in the days leading up to his death, that light began to fade. Brandon Hayes was not from Linden, nor did he embody the quiet, friendly nature of its residents. His presence in the town was more of an intrusion than a welcome addition. With a criminal record and a reputation for violence, he was the kind of man who moved through life with destruction in his wake. Those who knew him described a man with a hair-tempered temper, someone who could switch from charming to terrifying in an instant. He had a history of drug abuse, brushes with the law, and a string of broken relationships that all seemed to end in turmoil. But perhaps what was most disturbing about Brandon Hayes was his ability to mask the monster beneath. To the outside world, he was just another boyfriend. To those closest to him, he was a ticking time bomb. Corinne Baker was 25 years old and had spent much of her life searching for stability she could never quite hold on to. She had been in and out of difficult relationships, often drawn to men who mirrored the struggles of her past. By the time she met Brandon Hayes, she had already endured more hardship than most her age. Her relationship with Hayes was volatile, marked by moments of affection, overshadowed by something far more dangerous. Friends had seen bruises on her arms, noticed the way she flinched at loud voices. But Corinne, like so many others trapped in cycles of abuse, stayed, and Dominique, just a child, had no choice but to stay with her. It was a Sunday. The air was crisp with the lingering chill of early spring, but the sky was clear, the sun climbing steadily as the town of Linden eased into its usual rhythm. Families filled the pews of local churches. Others took their children to the park, enjoying the last stretch of the weekend before Monday's routine set in again. But inside a small apartment, hidden away from the peaceful hum of the town, a nightmare was unfolding. By the time authorities were called to the scene, the horror had already reached its peak. A little boy, barely old enough to understand cruelty, had suffered a level of violence no child should ever endure. The walls of that apartment had absorbed his pain, the floor bearing witness to a crime that would haunt everyone who stepped inside. The officers who arrived would later speak of the silence that filled the space, a silence too heavy for a place that should have been filled with the laughter of a child. The investigation that followed would uncover a truth so harrowing that it would shake even the most hardened detectives. How did no one stop this sooner? How could this happen in a town like Linden? As the details of Dominick's final hours came to light, one thing became painfully clear. His death was not an accident. It was the result of unchecked violence, systemic failures, and the inability of those around him to intervene in time. And now all that remained were the questions. Questions that demanded answers. Questions that would force an entire community to confront a reality they never thought possible. Dominick Richard Calhoun was the kind of child who could light up a room simply by walking into it. At just 4 years old, he carried an infectious energy that made those around him feel lighter. He had a mischievous grin, the kind that made people smile even when they didn't want to. His blonde hair was often a tousled mess from running around, his small hands always reaching for something new to explore. But whether it was chasing after his older brother, playing with his toy cars, or simply curling up on the couch with his mother, Dominick embraced life with wide-eyed enthusiasm. Despite the instability that lingered in his home, Dominick found ways to be happy. He had an unshakable bond with his older brother Tyler, who was his protector, playmate, and best friend. The two of them were inseparable, their laughter filling the small apartment where they lived. Tyler, just a few years older, took on the role of watching over his little brother. Even at such a young age, he knew Dominick needed someone looking out for him. Their mother, Corinne Baker, loved her children, but her life had been shaped by hardship. At 25, she had already endured more struggles than many experienced in a lifetime. Her relationships were often turbulent, her choices clouded by desperation for love and stability. And, in one of those desperate searches, she met a man who would change everything. Brandon Hayes did not come from a place of love. His childhood was marked by neglect, instability, and early exposure to violence. Raised in a home where anger dictated every conversation, he learned from a young age that control came through force. There was no warmth in the way he was spoken to, no reassurance that he was valued. Instead, there were harsh words, heavy hands, and a lesson ingrained into him that strength was measured by how much fear one could instill in others. As a teenager, his behavior became more volatile. He struggled in school, frequently finding himself in trouble for fighting, skipping classes, and lashing out at authority figures. His brushes with the law started early, with arrests for petty crimes, theft, and vandalism. But as he grew older, those minor offenses escalated. His rap sheet lengthened, including charges for drug possession, assault, and domestic violence. Relationships for Brandon followed a familiar pattern. They often started with charm, grand gestures and sweet words that masked what lay beneath. But eventually, the anger would surface, the jealousy, the control, the need to dominate. Those who got too close either left or learned the hard way that once Brandon Hayes had control, he wouldn't let go easily. By the time he met Corinne Baker, he had already left a trail of destruction behind him. Corinne Baker met Brandon Hayes at a low point in her life. She had been struggling to find stability, bouncing between relationships, trying to provide for her 2 young children. When Brandon entered the picture, he was charming, attentive, and offered a presence that, at first, seemed protective. He showered her with attention, made promises of a better life, and convinced her that he was someone she could depend on. But that illusion didn't last. The cracks in their relationship began to show early. Friends noticed bruises on Corinne's arms. They saw the way she withdrew from those who had once been close to her. She made excuses, justifying the outbursts, the shouting, the moments when Brandon's anger got the best of him. She convinced herself that things would get better, that she could handle it. By the time the abuse became undeniable, she was in too deep. The apartment they shared was small, cramped, and filled with an unspoken tension that never fully lifted. Financial struggles weighed heavily on them. Brandon was jobless, relying on whatever money Corinne could bring in, often demanding more than she had to give. Drug use became a part of their daily lives, further fueling his unpredictable temper. Dominick, too young to understand the complexities of addiction or financial strain, only knew that the home he lived in didn't always feel safe. He knew when to be quiet, when not to make a sound, when to stay out of sight, but no matter how careful a child tried to be, in a home ruled by violence, innocence was never enough to protect them. In the days leading up to April 11, 2010, the tension inside that small apartment reached a dangerous level. Brandon's temper had been worse than usual. He had been lashing out more frequently, his frustration boiling over at even the smallest inconveniences. His anger wasn't just directed at Corinne anymore. It was seeping into every corner of the home, threatening to consume anything in its path. Dominick, unaware of the full weight of the danger surrounding him, still carried his usual playful energy. He still clutched his toy cars, still laughed with his brother, still sought comfort in the only world he knew. But the warning signs were there. A neighbor reported hearing shouting late into the night, a violent argument that went on for hours. Someone close to Corinne noticed a new bruise forming beneath her eye. The tension in the apartment was suffocating, an undeniable sign that something was about to break. And when it did, the consequences would be devastating. The air inside the small apartment was thick with tension. Days of hostility had built up, each argument more heated than the last. Brandon Hayes' rage had been simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to explode. And on that fateful morning, it did. It began with something trivial. Something that, under normal circumstances, would have been dismissed as a child's innocent mistake. Dominick, with his tiny hands and playful nature, had accidentally spilled cereal on the floor. The mess wasn't much, just a few scattered flakes and a puddle of milk near the couch. But to Brandon, it was an offense that required punishment. His voice boomed through the apartment, sharp and unforgiving. Corinne flinched at the sound, instinctively shrinking into the background. Tyler, Dominick's older brother, froze, knowing all too well what was coming. And Dominick, too young to fully grasp the weight of the moment, stood there, his bright blue eyes widening, as Brandon's fury turned toward him. The first strike was sudden, a brutal slap that sent Dominick stumbling backward, his small body unable to withstand the force. The boy let out a cry, startled more than anything, but that sound only seemed to fuel Brandon's anger. He grabbed Dominick by the arm, shaking him violently, his words slurred with rage. What should have been a moment of discipline, if one could even call it that, became something else entirely. The violence escalated rapidly. Dominick was thrown onto the couch, his tiny frame barely making an impact against the worn cushions, before another blow followed. Corinne watched, paralyzed. She had seen Brandon angry before, had felt the weight of his fists herself, but this was different. This wasn't a man lashing out in frustration, this was something else. Yet, she did nothing. Dominick's cries turned to whimpers, his body curling inward as if trying to make himself disappear. But Brandon wasn't finished. What followed was an attack so vicious, so unrelenting, that the very walls of the apartment seemed to bear witness to the horror. Brandon didn't stop with a few hits. He kicked, he punched. He threw Dominick against the wall with enough force to leave a dent in the plaster. The child's body, delicate and small, was no match for the strength of a grown man. Each impact sent shockwaves of pain through him, but he was too weak to fight back. He only knew that he wanted it to stop. At some point, the assault became more than just anger. It turned into something calculated, something drawn out. Brandon inflicted injuries that no child should ever endure, all while Corinne stood by, doing nothing to stop it. Whether out of fear or indifference, she let it happen. The hours stretched on, and Dominick's small body endured unimaginable suffering. By the time the attack finally ceased, he was barely conscious. His once bright eyes, full of life and curiosity, were dull, glazed over in shock. His breathing was shallow, his tiny chest rising and falling with great effort. But even then, Brandon wasn't finished. With no sense of remorse, no moment of hesitation, he dragged Dominick's frail body into the bedroom and left him there, alone, broken, and slipping away. When the violence ended, the apartment fell into silence. Brandon, unbothered by what he had done, carried on as if nothing had happened. He sat on the couch, smoked, and ignored the fragile life fading away just feet from him. Corinne remained quiet, her eyes darting toward the closed bedroom door where her son lay. She didn't check on him. She didn't call for help. She did nothing. Hours passed before anyone outside those walls knew what had taken place, but even as the morning turned into afternoon, no help arrived. Dominick, barely clinging to life, lay in that darkened room, suffering in silence. It wasn't until much later, when the reality of what had happened became impossible to ignore, that the walls of that apartment would finally echo with the sounds of sirens. But by then, it was too late. The call to 911 came late, far too late. It wasn't made by Corinne Baker, nor was it a desperate plea from a remorseful Brandon Hayes. Instead, it was a concerned relative who, after hearing fragmented details about what had happened, decided to act. The voice on the line was urgent, but the dispatcher could only gather bits and pieces. A child was hurt, badly. When emergency responders arrived at the small apartment in Linden, Michigan, they weren't prepared for what they were about to witness. The front door creaked open to reveal an unremarkable living space, nothing out of place at first glance. But inside the bedroom, a different reality unfolded. Dominick Calhoun lay motionless, his small body bruised and broken. His injuries were beyond anything paramedics had encountered in a routine emergency call. His skin was marred with deep bruising, his limbs unnaturally stiff, as if he had been left there for hours. His breathing was nearly undetectable. One paramedic immediately dropped to his knees, checking for a pulse. It was faint, barely present. A rush of activity followed. An oxygen mask was fitted over Dominick's face, and efforts to stabilize him began. But even in those frantic moments, the seasoned first responders exchanged looks that spoke the truth neither wanted to say aloud. They had seen enough cases like this to know the odds. Meanwhile, law enforcement moved through the apartment. They noted the disarray, the stains on the carpet, the evidence of struggle. Brandon Hayes stood nearby, silent and detached, while Corinne Baker hovered in the background, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression unreadable. Neither made an immediate effort to explain what had happened. It wasn't just the state of Dominick's body that alarmed them, it was the atmosphere itself. A cold, suffocating silence had settled over the apartment, as if all life had been drained from it long before authorities arrived. Officers secured the scene, collecting what they could before forensic teams arrived. The living room showed signs of a struggle. Furniture displaced, remnants of spilled food, a broken toy in the corner. The bedroom, where Dominick had been found, was far worse. Bloodstains marked the mattress, and impressions in the carpet suggested someone had been dragged. Investigators took note of the household conditions. A burnt spoon in the kitchen, drug paraphernalia, empty liquor bottles stacked against the wall. Signs of neglect were everywhere. There was no evidence that Dominick had been taken to a hospital or given any medical care in the hours following the assault. And then, there was the most damning piece of evidence. The boy's body itself. He had suffered blunt force trauma, burns and fractures. Every indication pointed to a prolonged and merciless attack. When the medical examiner later conducted an autopsy, the full scope of Dominick's suffering was revealed. His injuries were extensive, consistent with repeated abuse over an extended period. His tiny hands were swollen, his ribs fractured. His cause of death? Blunt force trauma, exacerbated by prolonged neglect and untreated wounds. The report would be crucial in securing justice. At the police station, Brandon Hayes sat in a dimly lit room, arms crossed, face hardened. He was brought in for questioning immediately, but his demeanor remained indifferent. The detective across from him had seen men like him before, men who thought they could outmaneuver the system, who believed they were smarter than the evidence laid against them. At first, Brandon denied everything. "It wasn't me," he claimed. "He fell." But the injuries told a different story. No fall could explain the bruising, the burns, the fractures. The detective pressed further. "You expect me to believe a 4-year-old did this to himself?" Brandon's jaw tightened. He shifted in his chair, eyes darting to the one-way mirror on the wall. He tried a different angle. "Maybe his mom knows something," he muttered. "I wasn't there the whole time." Another lie. Phone records placed him in the apartment for days. There were no witnesses to confirm he had left at any point before emergency responders arrived. Hours passed, and the questions kept coming. Investigators played audio from the 911 call, showed crime scene photos, detailed Dominick's injuries. Brandon's responses became shorter, less confident. The weight of the evidence pressed down on him. Then came the psychological tactics. Silence. A pause long enough for guilt to creep in, a reminder that the truth would eventually come out, with or without his cooperation. Finally, the cracks began to show. His breathing grew uneven, his hands clenched into fists, and then, at last, he spoke. "I wouldn't stop crying." The detective didn't react, letting the moment stretch. Brandon exhaled sharply, frustration flickering in his eyes. He was always whining, making a mess. He was out of control. The words came faster now, as if unburdening himself would lessen the weight of his actions. "I just snapped." It wasn't an apology, it wasn't remorse, but it was the beginning of the truth coming to light. The courtroom was silent as the bailiff called the case. Every seat in the gallery was occupied, journalists scribbling in notepads, local residents whispering among themselves, and family members watching with weary, tear-streaked faces. The trial of Brandon Hayes was more than just a legal proceeding. It was the reckoning of a crime that had left the entire community in shock. Seated at the defendant's table, Brandon wore a suit, a stark contrast to the man authorities had arrested just months before. His expression was cold, unreadable, as if the weight of the accusations had yet to touch him. Across the room, Dominick's family sat in quiet anguish, clutching photographs of the little boy who had once filled their lives with laughter. The prosecution wasted no time in painting a clear picture of what had happened. On the days leading up to April 11, 2010, the prosecutor's voice rang through the courtroom. This defendant systematically tortured a 4-year-old child, inflicting injuries so severe that doctors were left speechless. He did this not in a fit of sudden rage, but repeatedly, methodically. And when that child lay dying, instead of seeking help, he ignored his suffering. The jury listened as medical experts took the stand, detailing the extent of Dominick's injuries. Bruises, burns, fractures. A body so battered it told the story without the need for words. The photographs shown on the screen were too much for some in the courtroom. A woman gasped. A juror turned away. Then came the witnesses. Neighbors who had heard the shouting, the thuds against the walls. A family member who described the phone call that led to the 911 report. A paramedic who recounted the horror of finding the boy unresponsive. And then Dominick's mother, Corinne Baker, was called to testify. Her presence was met with tension. She had been arrested alongside Brandon Hayes, originally facing charges of child abuse and neglect. But after reaching a plea deal, she agreed to testify against him in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her voice trembled as she spoke. He told me not to call anyone," she admitted. "He said Dominick was fine, that he'd be okay. But he wasn't okay." The prosecution pressed harder. "You ever tried to stop him?" A long pause, a shaky breath. "I was scared," she finally said. "He threatened me. He said if I tried anything, I'd end up just like Dominick." The courtroom was thick with unspoken judgment. Fear, perhaps, but also guilt. Brandon's attorney knew there was little hope of an outright acquittal. The evidence was overwhelming, the injuries undeniable. Instead, the defense focused on mitigating factors. Brandon's upbringing, his troubled past, his struggles with addiction. "He grew up in violence," the defense attorney argued. "He was never shown love, never taught right from wrong. He was raised in a world where fists solved problems, where cruelty was survival." They called on a psychologist who described Brandon's history: abuse at the hands of his own father, years spent in and out of the system. They painted him as a man lost to his demons, consumed by drug addiction, spiraling into a state of uncontrollable rage. He is not a monster, the attorney insisted. He is a product of his environment. But the jury's eyes were cold. They had seen the images. They had heard the testimonies. Whatever sympathy might have existed was buried beneath the weight of what had been done to Dominick. On the final days of the trial, the prosecution presented one last piece of evidence. A recording recovered from Corinne Baker's phone. A grainy, shaky video, captured in the dim light of the apartment. The audio was muffled but clear enough. A child crying, pleading. Then a voice. Brandon's voice. "You think you can cry your way out of this?" A loud slap. A scream. "Just want to act like a baby? I'll treat you like a baby." The video cut off, but the damage was done. A collective shudder moved through the courtroom. Brandon's expression remained unchanged. No remorse, no reaction. After days of deliberation, the jury returned. The courtroom stood as the judge read the verdict. On the charge of first-degree felony murder, we find the defendant guilty. A sob broke from the gallery. A reporter hurried to write down the words. Brandon Hayes stood motionless as the weight of the decision settled in. The judge's final words carried the force of justice. "Mr. Hayes, your actions were not just cruel, they were inhumane. You robbed an innocent child of his future, his dignity, his life. This court finds no justification for what you have done. Therefore, I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." A collective exhale filled the courtroom. Relief. Grief. Closure. Brandon was led away in handcuffs, disappearing through a door that marked the end of his freedom. But for the town of Linden, Michigan, the scars of his actions would remain. Dominick Calhoun's name would not be forgotten. The courtroom had fallen silent, but the echoes of the trial lingered far beyond its walls. The sentence had been handed down. Brandon Hayes would spend the rest of his life behind bars, and the legal proceedings were over. But for those left behind, the true weight of the crime did not end with a verdict. The Calhoun family was left shattered, their grief an open wound that no amount of justice could heal. Dominick's grandmother, Cheryl, had been one of his fiercest protectors, and her sorrow took a quiet, heavy form. She avoided interviews, spoke only when necessary, and kept to herself in the months that followed. But her pain was unmistakable. It was in the way she held on to Dominick's favorite blanket, the way she refused to move a single toy from the space where he had once played. Corinne Baker, Dominick's mother, had her own reckoning to face. She had been sentenced to time behind bars for her role in allowing the abuse to happen. Some believe she was as much a victim as Dominick, trapped under Brandon Hayes' control. Others saw her as complicit, a mother who failed to act when her son needed her most. Even from her prison cell, the weight of public judgment followed her. In Linden, Michigan, the small community that had once been just another quiet town, a transformation began. The crime had rattled the residents in a way that few things could. Strangers, neighbors, and friends all asked the same question. How had this been allowed to happen? Why had no one stopped it before it was too late? In Dominick's memory, a vigil was held in the town square. Hundreds gathered, candles in hand, as his picture was projected onto a screen. People spoke. Teachers who had never met him, mothers who imagined their own children in his place, police officers who had worked the case and would never forget what they had seen. The event was meant to be a moment of closure, but for many it only deepened the sense of collective responsibility. Shortly after the trial, a local group launched a child advocacy initiative in Dominick's name. They raised awareness about the warning signs of abuse, pushed for stronger intervention policies, and made it their mission to ensure that no child suffered in silence. His story had become a rallying cry, a reminder of the price of inaction. The trial had gripped the nation, and the media dissected every detail. True crime shows aired special segments on the case. Talk show hosts debated the justice system's handling of child abuse cases. Online, people pored over court documents, analyzing every testimony, every piece of evidence, trying to understand the mind of a man capable of such cruelty. On social media, the reactions were immediate and visceral. Hashtags demanding justice for Dominick trended for weeks. The crime scene details, the harrowing 911 call, and the gut-wrenching testimony from the trial were shared and reshared, igniting conversations about how such tragedies could be prevented. Some online discussions turned into heated debates. Should Corinne Baker have been sentenced more harshly? Did the justice system fail Dominick long before his death? Others shifted the focus onto the foster care system, questioning whether children in unsafe environments were truly being protected. While some used their platforms to raise awareness, others exploited the case for sensationalism. Conspiracy theories spread, unfounded claims about what had really happened behind closed doors. The noise of speculation often drowned out the reality that a little boy had lost his life, and that the focus should be on ensuring it never happened again. In the aftermath, larger discussions emerged about systemic failures. The signs of abuse had been there. Why had no one intervened sooner? Some questioned the role of child protective services. Reports had surfaced that there had been previous concerns about Dominick's safety, but no decisive action had been taken. The agency, already overburdened and underfunded, had let another child slip through the cracks. Advocates demanded reform, calling for stronger intervention policies and mandatory checks when reports of child abuse were made. Others focused on domestic violence. Brandon Hayes had a documented history of aggression, yet he had continued to move freely through society. The failure to recognize his potential for extreme violence had cost a child his life. Organizations for domestic abuse survivors used the case as an example of why more resources were needed for those trapped in dangerous situations. They argued that if Corinne Baker had received real support, if she had been given a safe way out, perhaps Dominick would still be alive. As months turned into years, Dominick's story never fully faded. His face remained on advocacy websites, his name mentioned in discussions about child protection laws. The pain of his loss remained raw, a wound on the heart of a town that had learned, too late, the cost of silence. Justice had been served, but justice was not enough. The true question remained: how many more children would suffer before the system finally changed?